Most people are probably familiar with the ghost stories from the Western region, but have you ever heard of the spooky stories from local neighborhoods? Today, I want to share with you the ghost stories from my neighborhood, Zom Chet Bak. I was born and raised here and have lived here for 17 years. Zom Chet Bak is a hamlet in my district that I won't mention here. Over the years, I've heard many tales of supernatural events and they still linger around the neighborhood. Everyone seems to be afraid, but I haven't witnessed anything yet. Feeling bored and melancholic, I asked my father, who had moved to Zom Chet since the forest was still dense, what he knew about the area. He wasn't afraid to tell me everything from beginning to end, making me completely enamored with the stories. When my father married my mother, they moved from Zom Kinda to Zom Chet Bak. When they arrived, my father settled us down on a small piece of land surrounded by forests on three sides, with only one side cleared for farming. There were a few houses in the cleared area, and then my grandfather's house. My grandfather had arrived there before my father. After my father built a small shop selling groceries by the river, my grandfather taught children in the poor neighboring areas until his death. My father told me that the area beyond our land was all jungle, and the Viet Cong hid within it. They fired guns and set off bombs, with soldiers and enemies chasing one another. Nobody dared to come here until the peace was established and people started to clear and settle in Kin Tay. Zom Chet Bak also has another meaning. It is the nickname of a soldier who sacrificed himself here. His name was Ba Men. I don't know much about his service or accomplishments, but it is heart-wrenching to hear how he was hunted by the enemy. His house was close to my grandfather's house, and he was chased by two enemies from there to the crossroad at my grandfather's house. At that time, the river was very small, only a few meters wide. He attempted to flee to the jungle on the other side of the river, but the enemy had already surrounded him. He was shot and his internal organs were removed and thrown onto the bushes. He died right next to the river close to my house. I never knew about his sacrifice until my father told me. His family is still here, and their descendants are my neighbors, but I never realized it. There are many jungles in this area and so many soldiers have died that my father couldn't even count. These pieces of land are now known as the group cemetery. Next is the story of Khu Doi Mo, the year when the Khmer and American soldiers flooded this area. Soldiers were killed and lay dead on my village road, the first being the Americans. Later in 1985, members of my family joined the fight against the Khmer Rouge, traveling from Can Tho to Cambodia. Even Na Ba Lao, my father told me of a man whose name he could not remember who had beheaded hundreds of mean people in this area. At the time of the conflict, there was still jungle, and the small river provided a safe place to flee. Unable to bear the endless pursuit and killing, he and other soldiers devised a plan to lure the mean people deep into Ba Lao, where they captured and tied them up one by one. The man dug a big hole and chopped off the heads of each person, and with his hands alone he beheaded hundreds, sparing only one who escaped his grasp. During the Peace of Vietnam, the hole was covered, and the road was overrun with the dead. A stretch close to town was filled with just bones and skulls, and no one dared to clear that piece of land. It was later named Khu Doi Mo, haunted by headless ghosts and dead bodies that searched for limbs at night, tormenting the residents. Father, other than Ba Men, are there any other stories? Yes, there is the story of the bamboo grove. Which bamboo grove, Dad? The bamboo grove in Khu Doi Mo. Son, do you want to hear the story? My father squinted out towards the large riverbank, sighing deeply as he recounted a tale full of contemplation. In the middle of 2012, he had heard rumors at the market that someone had died nearby. Turns out, it was a young girl who had gotten lost in the forests of Chet Bak. She was raped and murdered, and her body was left near Doi Moi. Her family claimed she had a mental disability, so the case wasn't investigated, and eventually, weeds grew over her grave with little attention paid to it. It wasn't until many brutal incidents occurred that people started coming and paying their respects to her grave, hoping to appease her spirit. Everyone in this area spoke of a haunting shadow, not knowing if it was a ghost or a demon. Some said it was a red shadow, while others claimed it was white. Whatever it was, that shadow had been lurking around for years, and my family was one of its victims. First, it was my cousin, who was in his early 20s, already a timid boy afraid of ghosts. and used to come home very late. One night, when he was driving past Doi Moi, he felt a strange chill down his spine. It's common knowledge that there are many ghosts around at night, so he tried to calm himself down, thinking he could make it home safely. But it wasn't long until he saw a white shadow holding a broom in the middle of the road. Who would be sweeping the street at midnight? He got scared, lost concentration, and drove into a pole. Fortunately, he only suffered minor injuries, but he could still see the shadow clutching the broom, laughing coldly. He couldn't take it anymore and immediately started his scooter, racing back to his home, not caring about the distance he had to cover. When he arrived, he was so shaken that he went straight to the bathroom, took a cold shower, and went straight to bed. From then on, his wife never let him go out late at night and take the Doi Moi route. She urged him to go straight to his grandmother's house and stay there till sunrise. After my cousin's story, his wife told us that even she had experienced something frightening. As a child, she was afraid of ghosts and once had to work late into the night. As she was walking home, she heard a faint voice whispering behind her, "Don't hurry, or you might fall." Just one sentence was enough to frighten her to death. She didn't understand what it meant. But every time she met her, she wasn't as timid as her cousins. She just yelled to tell her to slow down and be careful not to fall. It repeated several times, until the day when she and her went out together in the afternoon. They passed by the spot where the bamboo shadow covered the road, and she drove with such high speed that caused her to be frightened. I didn't understand what happened until we were close to home and she asked me, "Did you hear anything when we passed by the bamboo grove earlier?" I shook my head, because I really didn't hear anything, but she heard the voice of a girl calling after them, which was very scary, so she ran fast while I was sitting behind and I didn't hear anything. Continuing the story of my sister as my father, which has not been long since it happened about half a year ago. One afternoon, my dad, he went to drink at a friend's house far away. Knowing that he was driving, he didn't drink too much, and my father, who was easily scared by shadows, knew right away when someone was there, even if it was just a gust of wind. But this time, he didn't see anything and was seriously injured and lost his life because he ran across the cemetery. My father recounted that while he was driving back safely, he had just passed by the bamboo shadows. He heard a howling sound calling out to him from behind. He thought someone was calling out to him. He turned around and stopped the car to look. Just a few seconds later his car was hit by something like a push that pushed it forward, fiercely. My father lost consciousness and fell out of the car. Fortunately, someone from afar saw him lying there and was so scared that they threw their bike aside and pulled my dad up. It was Uncle Lip, the motorbike taxi driver. He was confused when he pulled my father up because the car was deeper than where my father fell, as if it was in a deep pond. After pulling him and the car up, my father regained consciousness and looked for his phone when he heard it ringing. At the time, it was my mother calling because she was worried that my father hadn't come home, fearing he was out drinking too much. Fortunately, they found my father, who was pale because the phone was a few paces away, with his hand on the ground, and the ground was very deep. It was so deep that the water came up to his neck. Even children died because of it, let alone adults, while many others have died similarly. My father recounted a story while he was riding his bike home comfortably, only just passing a mound of weeds when he heard a howling sound and someone calling out from behind. He thought someone had called him, so he turned his head to look. Just then, something pushed his bike forward, causing him to lose his balance and fall. Half of the bike and his body lay under a ditch. Luckily, someone passing by saw him lying there and stopped to help. It was his uncle, who was also riding his motorbike home. He pulled my father out, and they were both confused as to why the bike had fallen so deep into the ditch. It was so deep that it filled with water up to their necks, and even children had drowned in it before. Later, when my father arrived home, he was covered in scratches and had a bloody face. He told me that he felt like someone had pulled him back before he fell, and if he hadn't been pulled back, he would have fallen into the ditch. He showed me the rip in his clothes where someone had pulled him with strong force. My mother was anxious and worried about his injuries, and she tended to his wounds and lit the incense on the ancestral altar to pay respects. She then said that she would buy offerings for the ghosts of the Doi Moi route the next day. That night, I was sound asleep when I saw an old woman appear out of nowhere. I couldn't see her face clearly, but she spoke with a voice that sounded ancient. Despite being half asleep, she told me, "You're lucky your grandma pulled you back, otherwise, you would have been pushed by a demon and died." I didn't hear anything else after that, and she disappeared, leaving me feeling weird, so I went back to sleep. The next morning, I tried to remember if anyone had talked to me the night before, and wondered why my grandma had come to save me. Terrified, I went to tell my mother what happened, and she said my dad's late mother had come to help him. The night before, my mother had lit incense on the altar to ask my grandparents for protection, and grandfather and grandmother came to protect my father. After that incident, my mother went to buy offerings for the ghosts along the Doi Moi route. My father was scared and didn't go out at night to drink anymore. In the following weeks or months, there were other incidents of people encountering ghosts while passing by the same route, especially those who stopped at Bob Bay's drink store near their house. Some people witnessed a rolling ball that suddenly turned into a human head, and a ghostly soldier of the Khmer Rouge emerging from the bushes, searching restlessly with no head on his shoulders. Because of these ghostly encounters, many avoided traveling that road at night, including the man who lived at his wife's house for several days after being too scared to go home. There's another story that an old man tells about being chased by a ghost. He was walking home one night, and his house was close to the road where the ghost appeared. He felt something jumping behind him, and when he turned around, he saw a figure in military clothing with a missing leg. The figure took one step and leapt towards him. Terrified, he ran home with his cart and didn't stop until he reached his house. He locked the door, leaving his wife and children frightened by his appearance. He still shudders at the thought, despite being in his old age. No one dares to walk that road at night since it's the only exit out of the village. I thought there were no more stories left until I heard the sound of a motorcycle in the village. It was Mr. Tam, the local taxi driver who I didn't pay much attention to since I rarely went to work. But on the day he picked me up, I looked around the dirt road but didn't see any ghosts. Even though I came home late at night, I never saw any ghosts in that area. Maybe I was too heavy-hearted to notice. Mr. Tam became eager to tell another story about when he was riding his taxi late at night. He said that he saw a small girl on top of a bamboo tree from afar. He wasn't sure if it was a ghost or an evil spirit, but he saw it swing down from the tree to the ground, repeatedly doing so on the middle of the road. The creature even laughed joyfully, trying to scare him as he got closer. Mr. Tam was afraid, but he remembered his knowledge of magic, so he stopped the taxi and recited a spell. He drew a magic sign on the bamboo tree and told me that he had learned it a long time ago as a member of the Wahao religion. Even though he lived in my neighborhood, I never knew he was a magician, although my mother called him Master Tam. After hearing his story, I finally understood his nickname. He added that the ghost of the soldier still appears occasionally, but it's rare. Perhaps, only those who are afraid of ghosts or are easily frightened may encounter it. In my case, as someone who frequently returns home late at night, I don't often see ghosts. However, there are still odd moments that send shivers down my spine when passing by chilly and deserted regions. Regardless, our community is mindful of the lore and beliefs handed down by our ancestral traditions. Even Aunt Ku Doi Moi, the one who's known for retelling the scariest stories and legends of Chet Village, can attest to that.